Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us at this session of the Perth Writers Festival. My name is Nama Amram, and it's a great pleasure to introduce our guests today, Michael Rowbotham, Alan Carter, and Glen Duncan. Our topic of the session today is Portraying Evil. What is evil, where does it come from, and how far away from us does it live? So, a juicy topic. I think when I heard the topic, I was immediately fascinated. I think there's political and social and certainly moral and philosophical implications and layers to this topic. The three authors we have today, their books vary quite a lot in style, but I would say what they have in common is a monster of a narrative that hooks you right from the beginning. I think Nick Cave on the back of Glen Duncan's book endorsed the book saying it's full of genuine suspense, and I think that's true for all of our authors today. And the other thing they have in common is a very layered look at evil in its many forms. So I'll launch straight into introducing our first speaker today, Michael Rowbotham. Before writing full-time, Michael was an investigative journalist in Brittain, Australia and the US, and the ghostwriter of 15 biographies. Michael lives in Sydney with his wife and 3 daughters, and please make Michael feel welcome.
Thank you very much. We should call this the sick puppy session, because you're obviously all sick puppies. I'm going to start with a vox pop, actually. I want to ask, how many people here have ever contemplated killing someone? That's good, actually. I thought I was going to have to goad you into being more honest than that. You know, because it's one of the things I contemplate all the time. I wanted to kill the person that wrote Eat, Pray, Love. And then I wanted to kill the person that made it into a movie. There's loads of people, and it's funny, 2 psychologists, and I have their names here, I should actually mention them by name, Douglas Kenrick and David Buss, independently asked people if they ever fantasised about killing someone. And it could be as simple as wanting to push your mother-in-law under a bus, or put rat poison in the boss's coffee. And would you believe that 70 to 90% of men and between 50 to 80% of women admitted to having at least one homicidal fantasy in the preceding year? I mean, they're just fantasies, of course. I mean, so they're reasonably harmless. I'm very privileged to share a panel today with Alan and with Glen, both of whose works I've read and admire greatly. I think Glen, in particular, I talked about The Last Werewolf on the first Tuesday book club, and it's one of those books that it proves the devil gets the best lines and gets the filthiest women, and also werewolves can sort of produce. They get loads of sex. I mean, werewolves just get loads and loads of sex.
Look, I'm just the writer. I just work here. Okay, so no field research.
Yeah, there's no field research. No wish fulfillment. I mean, I'm fascinated by the psychology of crime. I write psychological thrillers, and I'm interested with it, the way crime ripples through communities and that doesn't just affect victims, but families and investigators. And my interest comes really from a man called Paul Brittain, a forensic psychologist who Cracker was based upon, the series Cracker, the brilliant BBC series that starred Robbie Coltrane. The inspiration for that series, which was written by Jimmy McGowan and Paul Abbott wrote the second series, was the work of Paul Brittain. And look, I know some of you may have heard a story that I often tell about. Paul Brittain was called into 74 Cromwell Street in Gloucester when 3 bodies had been found in the back garden of a house belonging to Fred and Rosemary West. Fred and Rosemary West were in custody, and they were denying all knowledge of how these bodies got into the back garden. One of them was believed to be their eldest daughter, Heather. And the police couldn't quite fathom what they were dealing with, so they called Paul Brittain down from Leicester, and he walked through the garden, and he walked through the house, and he went to the police station, and he saw Fred and Rosemary West being interviewed. And he sat down, and he looked at the bodies and how they'd been trussed up and left when they were buried. And he sat down with a senior detective, and he listed point by point that, first of all, these were serial sexual psychopaths who were responsible, and he listed point by point where they come from, how the power of people combining makes the crime not just doubly violent, but it increases it, enormously. And the very last point he made was that they bury their bodies close because they like to fantasize about what they've done. And at which point, the senior detective said, "Okay, so that's why they've used the garden." And Paul said, "No, they've used the garden because the house is full." And they dug up the basement and found 7 bodies in the basement. I was never and have never been interested in how those poor, unfortunate women died, and they did die in horrible ways. I was always fascinated with how Paul Brittain knew that. His understanding came from having spent over 20 years working with the criminally insane in secure institutions, and although he would never use the word evil, he just doesn't believe in using that word. He was dealing with people that had those sorts of minds. I wanted to sort of look at this area basically because I think it's one of those things that there's no algorithm for evil. I mean, there's no formula for it. But it was actually 40 years ago last year that the Stanford University experiment took place. And I'm sure you remember a very famous experiment where students were offered $15 a day to volunteer, and some of them became prison guards, and some of them became prisoners. And within a matter of days, the experiment had to be cancelled because the prison guards had turned into sadistic sort of brutes. And the prisoners weren't just plotting an escape, they were plotting to murder the guards. And it's 50 years since, it's 50 years since the Milgram experiment, the electric shock experiment. And that was 50 years last year as well. And that was where he took again volunteers, and some of them became teachers and some of them became students. And the students had to memorize certain sequences of words. And when they got the words wrong, the teacher had to give them an electric shock. And there were 45 levers, and each lever corresponded with another 15 volts. And as they pulled the lever, they would hear the screams and cries. Now, these were fake screams and fake cries, but the person pulling the lever didn't know that. And 65% of the people pulled the final lever, which had lethal and deadly written underneath it. So 65% of people pulled that. And it all came down to the findings that Milgram basically said in the end, is that power of the white coat, the power of the person in charge. Now, that's a nice thing to say that 35% of people didn't pull that lever. They might have pulled a lot of levers up until then. But I find it quite interesting. I think this area, you cannot understand the good that people can do and the good that humans are capable of unless you understand the evil that they can do. Now, here's the thing. If any of us were alive and living in Nazi Germany, and if we weren't Jewish, and if we weren't gay, and if we weren't gypsies, there is a very good chance that we would have been involved, been collaborated with, worked for, or at least, if not condoned, certainly stood and sat on our hands while terrible things were being done. And partly this is, and if you don't believe that's true, then you don't sort of understand history and you don't understand human behaviour. Belonging is so important for us. The sense of belonging to community and societies. And we don't want to often stand out, or we certainly don't want to upset other people. And we have a sort of value system associated with families and countries and belonging in communities. And in a corrupt society like that, you get drawn into it, and you become scared to actually raise your voice and stop something. It's quite interesting that I'm sort of getting my notes here. I knew I'd run out of. Let me explain something else to you as well. I mean, you had a situation with Hitler, obviously involved with killing 6 million people. You had a situation with Stalin killing 20 million people. And it's not a case, I'm not trying to compare evils here, but a little known fact was in the Ukraine in 1932, 3 million people starved. An entire country was starved by Stalin, forced starvation. 2,500 people were charged in the Ukraine with cannibalism. They cooked and ate their own children. That's how bad the famine got. This is well documented. I'm not sort of making this up. These are well documented cases. Now, there's an evil in that, but the greater evil, of course, is anyone that could starve a country and could turn people so mad, so crazy, that they would be compelled or forced to do such a thing. And there's the true evil. I mean, portraying evil, you know, for me, it's a case of, it's really looking at each of us and inside each of our hearts and what we're capable of. You know, and that's the sort of thing I draw upon when I look at writing my characters. They're not black and white villains. They are not, just as my heroes aren't sort of, you know, men on white horses wearing white hats that, you know, can outrun and outfight and outshag anyone. They have motivations and they are flawed, and I think, you know, the great, you know, to be able to sort of portray evil is really to be able to look into the dark side of all of our personalities and our hearts and realise that we are all capable of it in the right circumstances. You know, there will always be people that will make the poison gases. There will always be people that will justify making the poison gases or the weapons of mass destruction or whatever. There will be always those, and there'll be always governments that justify it. You know, we're all capable of it, and I think to understand or to portray evil, you just have to understand that.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. And I think that raises a very interesting question about nurture versus nature, which we'll get to later on in our panel discussion. Our next speaker is Alan Carter. Alan was born in Sunderland, UK in 1959. He holds a degree in Communication Studies from Sunderland Polytechnic and immigrated to Australia in 1991. Alan lives in Fremantle with his wife Kath and son Liam, and works as a television documentary director on such programs as Who Do You Think You Are and Desperately Seeking Sheila. Prime Cut is Alan Carter's... Oh no, hold it up for you. Prime Cut is Alan Carter's first novel, which he wrote while living in Hopetown as a kept man. Prime Cut won the 2011 Ned Kelly Crime Writing Award for Best First Fiction. Please make Alan feel welcome.
So I got an email from Nama a couple of weeks ago saying I wanted to talk for 10 minutes on what is evil. And I kind of thought, well, I'll ask the big questions, why don't you? So first of all, I went to the dictionary and I looked it up, and it came up with morally wrong or bad, wicked. And I thought, I'm never going to get away with that because I've got two erudite guys. I decided I've got people paying to come in here. I've got to do more than that. I should be more diligent in my research and, you know, go for it. So I went to Wikipedia. I thought I'd read. And on Wikipedia, I found how huge it was. I mean, it's a question that's vexed scholars, scientists, theologians, and news editors for centuries. You know, you've got the atheists saying, you know, does evil exist at all? You've got the Catholics saying, oh, yes, it does. And you've got the Buddhists saying, maybe, depends. And then I read up also on those Milgram experiments where you've got people prepared to, you know, electrocute their best friends at the drop of a hat. I wasn't sure whether that proved that we're all capable of evil, or just that American university students are capable of evil. I thought I'd leave it at that point. Basically, from that research, from that very detailed research, I spent at least 5 minutes on Wikipedia. I found out that news editors basically have worked it all out. They reckon that evil is whatever they say it is on any given day. So they're the only people who have sorted out. So I had to thought, well, maybe I'll better think for myself because it's all just a bit too big to think about. Huge question. And for me, it came down to an issue of predation. Animals will prey upon either their own species or other species as a basic matter of survival. I think Glen coined the three-word term very well in his book. I'll be...
Good luck with that.
To mate, kill and eat.
Yeah.
Glen will go into more detail on that.
Version.
Yeah. But So that's for basic survival within the animal kingdom, and that's kind of fair enough. But I think, I mean, there might be examples which no doubt any David Attenboroughs out there will alert me to, but it seems that humans are the only people who are predatory for fun or profit or some other kind of non-essential gratification. So for me, predatory behavior, particularly in crime fiction, goes to the core of what I see as evil in terms of writing and reading about it. So combining that with the idea of moral choice, Michael mentioned the idea of living under the Nazis, and yes, terrible things happened during that time and in Rwanda and the Balkans and other places since then, but the idea that you combine predatory behavior with the idea of having a moral choice and consistently choosing bad over good suggests to me a more evil intent than maybe if you've been forced into it. I'm sure many of the people who operated in Nazi times did terrible things to survive, and that would be the very nature of what they were living under at times as well, and others didn't, others did it for fun. So yeah, it was getting bigger and deeper, but basically I came down to predation and moral choice in terms of the literature and the writing of characters. So I then had to look at the characters in Prime Cut, and there are two essential parallel stories, two bad guys, if you like. One is a serial killer, and he's mad as a cut snake. He kills his wife and child in fairly horrible ways. The other one is a little Aussie battler who's an entrepreneur, and he's wanting to get his slice of the mining boom profits. And his way of evil is to prey upon the vulnerable, on migrant workers. Both have evil and predation within them. In trying to write my really evil character, I had to work out, how to let you know pretty early on that he's mad as a cut snake. So it starts off, he's watching the 1973 FA Cup final between Sunderland and Leeds. Sunderland won, by the way, 1-0. Just thought you needed to know that. And he's watching the game, loving it, and chatting away to his wife and child who are behind him on the sofa. It's not until towards the end of that scene that you realise that they've actually been dead for a couple of hours. He did it, and he's talking to them as if they're alive. That's the first indication that he's mad as a cut snake. The second is the way he's done it, which is I won't go into detail, but it's basically a combination of a hot-blooded application of brute force and a cold-blooded application of science, two things going together. That to me suggests a certain kind of evil as well, when you don't do things in hot blood but in cold blood. I think the third thing to prove that he was evil was that he walked out at half-time and didn't bother coming back to watch the rest of the game. And it had to be as mad as a cut snake he could do that. So the next question was it where does it live?
How far away?
How far away
from us does it live?
Where does it come from? That was the next one. I suggest, well, I don't really know where it comes from. Probably deep inside of us. I know that Jermaine Greer the other night talked about this primeval slime mold that we've all got some DNA linked to. I don't know whether she's referring to the men in the audience or everybody in the audience, but I guess that primeval slime mold would be a good place to have evil originate in. And then there's the idea of how far away from us does it live. Again, the obvious question. It is
in all of us, yes.
Yeah, it would be inside all of us, be very close to home. When I was writing about where evil lived, I decided I was a bit too much of a coward to have it too close to home, so I set it in the street next to where I grew up. So that was far enough away from me. Maud Street, don't go there. So I've answered all the questions now, haven't I?
You have, yes. Please thank Alan.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll be going into more detail into some of those questions in a moment. But for now, I'd like to introduce Glen Duncan. and Glen's latest book is The Last Werewolf. Glen Duncan was born in 1965 and studied philosophy and literature at Lancaster University. His first novel, Hope, was published in 1997 and has been followed by 6 novels. I, Lucifer, was shortlisted for the Geoffrey Faber Memorial Prize, and Glen's work has been translated into more than a dozen languages. Glen was named by the Times Literary Supplement as one of Britain's 20 best young novelists, and he lives in London. Please welcome Glen Duncan.
Hi, it is aesthetically apposite that we've got this stained glass in here, because it's sort of where I want to start with this question. Because it reminds me of being in church when I was a child. As a Roman Catholic child, all these questions are very simple and straightforward and easily settled. It's a very simple schema. There's God, and he's good, and he wants you to do good. And then there's the devil, and he's absolutely, purely evil, and wants you to become absolutely and purely evil. It's very simple, it's very comforting. Unlike God, or at least the sort of sidelined God of the New Testament, the devil is absolutely hands-on, proactive. He's there behind you with a voice that says, do it. And it is always the wrong thing. I mean, whatever the wrong thing happens to be at that particular time. And the idea is that if you do enough of these wrong things, if you listen to the voice often enough, or, significantly, if you do one supremely or sufficiently wrong thing, that's it. You will burn forever in hell. I think of those as the good old days. It was enormously helpful, morally, to have the idea of an adversary, somebody that you were actually fighting against, somebody who had your own spiritual bankruptcy as the first item on their agenda. It really made it easy. Well, actually, it didn't make it easy, but it made sense of it, at least. It was also incredibly helpful to have the idea of facing, to put it mildly, some very, very serious consequences, for your evil actions. Forget jail rape. This is your soul burning for eternity. It's quite a good motivator, that. But then, unfortunately, along came secular debunking by way of a secular education and a philosophy degree. And that's really changed the whole game. What have you got now? If you haven't got the adversary and you haven't got the consequences, you've got earthly consequences, but there's no metaphysical architecture underpinning any of it. So that would mean as long as you could get away with it, you'd got away with it. But it's brought me, I suppose, to a point of having to ask the question in a different way. Rather than saying, what is evil? My question is, what are we doing when we use the word evil? And I think fundamentally what we're doing is we use the word evil when we are confronted with something that we refuse to attempt to imagine. It's a talismanic word. It connotes no forgiveness. It's the thing that is indelible. It's the thing from which there is no return. Once you have done this, you have left the species. Carry the word around with us like a magic charm so that we can keep people who do certain kinds of things at a distance. It's a denial of continuity. It's a denial of kinship. There's no hope. There's no dialogue. This person has reached the end. Crucially, they've become alien. They've become other. The tabloids love to say, what kind of monster does a thing like this? It's a rhetorical question. We don't really care what kind of monster it is, as long as it's not one of ours. That's the crucial thing. To relate that to the business of writing, which is sort of the other half, I think, of the dialogue that we want to have, the refusal to imagine is central to this. The problem with being a novelist is that you are compelled to imagine everything. I suspect, like both my colleagues here, when we first came into contact with the notion of evil or atrocity, some of these crimes that made the headlines, I suppose the one that lit the touch paper for me was the Moors murderers, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with. Myra Hindley and Ian Brady. I remember overhearing my parents talking about the case. And all I overheard, I knew that some children had been killed, and I knew that there was something to do with sex involved in it. And all I overheard them saying was, they made tapes. And for about 3 years after that, it was an incredibly long gestation period. But I finally understood that they made tapes of what they'd done so that they could listen to them afterwards by way of a sort of sexual garnish. Again, as a Catholic child, the link between sex, going back to the story of Eden, knowledge and evil, was already a fairly volatile conceptual trinity. The Moors Murderers story seemed to confirm that. There was something that these people, I suspected, knew as a result of having done what they'd done. And it was connected for them with sex, and it was connected with for them with cruelty. So those links were forged quite early in my imagination, I suppose. But to go back to the business of writing, W.H. Auden has a poem called The Novelist, which I never tire of alluding to because it's one of the few poems to me that constitutes the last word on its subject matter. It's not a long poem, but the last couple of stanzas are the crucial ones. He talks about he's talking about the novelist's responsibility to imagine. And he says, to achieve his lightest wish, he must become the whole of boredom, subject to vulgar complaints like love, among the just be just, among the filthy, filthy too, and in his own weak person, if he can, dully put up with all the wrongs of man. And that last line is crucial, because if you're a novelist, you have to put up with all the wrongs of man. The brief is absurd. You know, Auden's brief is absurd because he's suggesting that the novelist's goal is to become God. And yet, I suspect if I ask my friends here whether or not that rings some kind of basic bell, they might be tempted to agree. There is an overpowering compulsion to try and imagine everything. As soon as Michael told the story about the parents killing and eating their own children, which I had never heard before, immediately I thought, I want to write about that. I want to write a novel about that. The more extreme something is, the higher the obligation, it feels to me, if you were worth your salt as a writer, the higher the obligation is to go there and try and accommodate it. Whether we like it or not as artists, I think that the job is to find room for everything human. And whether we like it or not, these things are human. I'd like to say, just as a closer, fascinating to be reminded of the Milgram experiments. One of the candidates who refused to administer even one shock was a guy called Ron Ridenour, who later, as a slightly older man, was the guy who blew the lid on the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. So it's interesting that clearly there's a sort of moral continuity there.
Yeah.
Yes, there are people who do dreadful things, but there are other people who do the right thing. Of course, where the ability to choose in the correct way comes from is that's the subject of the discussion, I suppose. But that's me done, I think.
It's really interesting. Oh, sorry.
No, please.
That's really fascinating. When I told the story about the Ukraine, that you'd want to write about it because there's so much of it. As a journalist for so many years and working on some terrible cases and war zones and other places, so often the truth is so unbelievable and so horrible that I often find as a crime writer, and you're toning it down, that people won't actually believe the truth, and you find you have to tone it down to make it more palatable and believable. Because real life always, no matter what you come up with and how horrible it is, real life will always throw up something that's far worse. And I was stunned when I came across that information about, and the 2,500 people charged with cannibalism, and then that's only the tip of an iceberg. They were just the recorded cases.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's interesting because I just think, no, I don't think maybe I'm not a good enough novelist to think I could go there and make people believe it.
Well, if you can make people believe werewolf sex, I think you can do anything.
Yeah, everything else is easy after that.
Detail. Well, devil's in the detail.
Exactly, quite.
Actually, when you were talking, Glenn, it made me think of another writer who likes to throw good and evil upside down, Rosa Saramago, the Portuguese Nobel laureate, who he was banned from Portugal, in fact, for reimagining the devil and God in opposite positions. To me, oh no, hang on. Yes, that's right. I wanted to start by asking you about what you refer to as the bleedability between good and evil. So you're the hero of The Last Werewolf, who is a werewolf, seems disturbed or almost depressed by the moral ambiguity of life. would you say, why do you think we hang on to this idea of good and evil, and what would happen if we didn't?
Well, I mean, this goes back to what I began with saying. I mean, we hang on to it because it makes it psychologically easier to bear. It gives us a distancing technique. The word evil itself is a psycholinguistic defense mechanism. It just is a way of keeping something far away and in a box. So I think that's why we hang on to it. I mean, the passage that you're referring to in The Last Werewolf is when Jake says that this is what he's 200 years old and he's had enough, not surprisingly. And he says that he can't bear this bleedability of categories, one thing into another, laughter into tragedy and good into evil. And I suppose my feeling is that the longer you live, the more permeable those categories would become.
And he lives for about 200,
well, he's 201 by the time we find him in the narrative, and he's looking at a potential 400-year lifespan. But he's already knackered.
And, okay, Michael, your book opens with a different conversation. It's a conversation with a killer. And he says, people kill every day. Nurses push needles. Surgeons stop hearts. Butchers slay beasts. You're doing something good here. You and the others are going to be famous. You're going to create a day that would live forever. So, to me, this brought home the question of ideology. And in the context of terrorism as well, we often refer to wars and to terrorism. This seems to come up in most sessions I've attended at the festival. So what tools do we have, do you think, for judging good from evil, if any?
Oh, I think it's, everyone has their own sort of moral compass, and I find it quite interesting, even with, we have a belief system, and a belief, whether you're agnostic or an atheist or religious, you still have some form of belief system. And a belief system tends to answer those questions that we don't have answers to. They fill in the gaps. And some people will die for their beliefs. Some people will kill for their beliefs. And perhaps it's, we will never understand the reasons for that. And as I mentioned earlier, Paul Brittain, that he would never use the word, he will never use the word evil. And I agree with Glenn, it is an excuse that we don't have to actually try to look for understanding or explanation. We just label them, put it in a box as too hard and leave it alone. Most psychologists, very few of them would ever use that term, because they look for the reasons behind things rather than just putting a label on something.
Alan, what do you think on this? Do we have any tools for saying something is good and something is evil? Because we're saying, still we seem to make a division between choices that are not moral and that are moral. So we're giving examples of things that we're saying, we're shocked by it, that we imagine them. But do we have any tools to say this is good, this is not? But perhaps if we got rid of the word evil, but if we said, this is well, I don't know. Is there any other way of thinking about it that would mean it's an absolute line?
No.
No.
I mean, you can call it whatever you like. You could get rid of the word evil, but something of that nature will still exist out there, and we'll find some other word for it. And even as a concept, I know it's something that helps to distance, and across the ages, people have stepped back and forth across that line with ease and not seen a problem with that. And the people who have taken a moral choice to step across the line or have been forced across the line to survive, it happens all the time. And you can have people who are both good and bad at the same time. And I think that's kind of what the real world is like. But it's our job to try and capture that. And sometimes I think we might try and have some of that level of confusion and difficulty in there, but I think also we aim to try and simplify it by having good win out in the end. Even your werewolves.
Don't give the ending away. Sorry? Don't give the ending away.
Yeah, but I mean, you immediately, even though they kind of do terrible things, you're feeling sympathy, and you are carried along to kind of to be supporting their survival as well.
Yeah.
And so dealing with that as a novelist is all what makes it so interesting, I think.
Okay, so on the question of characters and the way you construct them, none of your characters are plain good or plain evil, but somehow at the end of it we find that we're able to forgive some of them and not others. I would say especially in your books, Michael and Alan. So what do you think makes it easier for us to ultimately forgive some of your characters and not forgive some of the others?
Oh,
and I'll put this to all three of you.
I know, it's quite simple. It's a case of creating villains that are real. I know it's a fact of human. It's human nature. It's hot-wired into us, even if we do something wrong, to try to justify it and to lessen how bad it was to ourselves. And whether it might sound like self-delusion, but it's hot-wired into all of us. Now, even something I told the story about Fred West earlier. When they unpacked Fred West's background, there were 3 generations of incest that ran through his family. And in every case, and when I create a villain, there's always a reason. Now, whether you agree with that reason or not, there's a reason why these people are doing what they're doing. And that doesn't make it any less horrible, but it does make it more real, because very few people... I don't write serial killer books where someone's just plain bad, born bad, always be bad, whatever. Society gets the monsters it deserves.
Glenn, can I... yes, please.
Well, I think this is what makes the language of absolutes really difficult, because my vision of the world is that it's a place of approximation and potential. The things that appear atrocious and monstrous, we can carry on using that language, but they're done by people who just the week before were living behind their white picket fences. It's not. You look at the effect of Vietnam on the young guys who went out there. They were, only weeks before in the Dairy Queen, drinking a milkshake. It's about being given the right conditions. So for me, it's never helpful to think in terms of absolutes. But in terms of characters, I think it's whether or not we forgive, or whether or not we can empathize with, or at least momentarily get into the head or the heart or the shoes of somebody who is committing atrocity, really depends on whether the writer has done his or her job. If your model is that there is a kinship, it is a case of continuity, it is only a case of being in the right circumstances, wrong place, wrong time, whatever. Or, to take Michael's point that there's a sort of deterministic element at work, that if you have had certain kinds of experiences, it fractures your psyche to the point where you're prone to do certain things, whether or not the conditions, externally arise. These would be the psycho serial killers and so on. But whether or not we can empathize with them depends on the writer's skill. I try and... Jake, before you all run away with the wrong idea, this is actually a comedy as well.
All 3 books are very funny. That's the scary thing. Can you joke about evil? Yes, you can. In the case of Jake, it was done by virtue of trying to make him funny and charming, but without, at the same time, sacrificing the notion that it was credible that he could do all these terrible things. That's the point, right? It's that every evil has a human face in the end, and everybody's got a little bit of the monster in them. So those are 2 halves of my equation.
Well, that's so true. The famous is it Hannah Arendt, the woman that wrote the Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem and the banality of evil. She coined the phrase, and there were 6 psychologists that went in and when Adolf Eichmann before he was put on trial, and they studied him, and they all came out and said, this guy loves his family, he loves his friends, he's got, there was nothing in the psychology of the man that suggested he was this sort of inherently evil or this monster.
And yet, Hannah Arendt later got criticised for that, because apparently she only spent an early part of the trial before she went away and wrote her great thesis. But apparently later on, Eichmann was almost gleefully describing the precision of what he had invented and developed to create the killing machine.
But it didn't change what the psychologists said about him when they studied him.
Yeah, but I think the glee with which he had produced the ultimate killing machine would probably be a clue that he's not quite everybody's favourite uncle.
Well, more on the question of writing. When I read your books, as you do when you read a good crime book, or you get this kind of, or I get a kind of paranoid feeling, like, you know, by engaging with evil, I might be inviting it in a way. And that happens when you're sort of sitting alone at night reading this book about this, you know, great big psychopathic killer. What's it like to get into the mind of evil and to go to those places where you imagine what most people wouldn't try to imagine?
The most difficult, best example I can give is I write first person present, and in one of my novels, a book called Shatter, quite a dark psychological thriller. It's a dual narrative, and one of the narrative voices is the killer. And in many ways, it's getting into the skin, inhabiting. It's very much like being an actor and trying to get into character. And this was someone who did horrible, horrible things. This character, and I would write these scenes and then come upstairs and have about 2 scalding hot showers and curl up in bed and just want to get that voice out of my head. And I afterwards, I remember telling my wife, I said, I don't want to ever go there again. You know, I hated being inside that character's head.
I mean, certainly having a central character who kills his wife and child made things difficult around the house for a while. So I did have to kind of watch me step and say, no, it's just writing, dear, don't worry.
And by the way, why don't I cook the dinner and do the washing up tonight as well?
Yeah, because I was a kept man at the time, so I had to get some of this stuff out.
Did you get paranoid, Alan, while you were writing?
No, not at all.
No?
No. But I think Michael's earlier point about the idea that we get the monsters we deserve. I mean, the main character, the main nasty character of Davy Arthur's, for most of the book, you're thinking this guy's mad as a cut snake, and as soon as somebody takes him out of circulation, the better. But we do at the end discover.
Don't give it away.
Don't you worry. That all of these things have some kind of reason behind them. Even if you don't agree with the reason, there is something there for you to hang on to that makes sense of why he might have done these terrible things. Still knowing that, and maybe even getting a little bit of sympathy for him, you're still glad that he's out of circulation. You want that to happen because you want that resolution, which you don't get in real life. And that's, again, kind of the service we provide.
Glenn, the same question to you.
To answer it in the context of The Last Werewolf is a bit tricky because it was an absolutely effortless act of imagination to put myself in Jake's shoes. I mean, it wasn't, and again, I stress this is a comedy. It really just is the case for me that the business doesn't change. It's always the imaginative act. You set up the question or the premise. In this case, what would it be like if every month you had to kill and eat another human being, or you died yourself? There are many people whose sort of reflex reaction to that would be to say, well, I'd just commit suicide. I wouldn't do it. But the thing is, you probably would. You'd find a way. I mean, unless you're one of a very, very small number of people, I suspect, you will find some negotiation with that condition. And I don't know, there probably is something wrong with me because I'm not reluctant to imagine these things.
See, the interesting thing, I think that is because that's a sort of a flight of fantasy. The thing with Shatter was because it was based on a real life event. You know, it was based on a man who would convince women. He would find information out about schoolgirls, and read newspapers, see a little story, and then would wait till the girl was safely at home, safely at school, and then get the mother at home. And he had just enough information to convince the mother that he'd kidnapped her daughter. And as a mother, you're not going to hang up and ring the school and find out she's safe. If you think there's even 1% chance he's telling the truth, you're going to stay on that line, and you're going to beg, and you're going to plead, and you're going to offer to take her place. And this is a character who mentally raped and then, raped women. And And it was based on a true life story. You know, there's a man in Sydney that did this to 600 women. You know, and I actually had transcripts because one of the women managed to press an answering machine and record what he was saying to her, and I actually had the transcripts, you know. And I think that's one of the reasons it was, because it was real, and it's also that I came across the story, an identical thing in Newcastle in England, and Paul Brittain had worked on catching the guy that did it. And so maybe that was it, because I was trying to create a story that people, you know, could think that could be me. Yeah. You know, this has happened, and that's why I think it was that.
I think it is quite different. I mean, if you're dealing with some sort of Gothic fancy here and a moral quandary that is written very large and sort of in Gothic dimensions, it's not quite the same as doing what Michael's talking about. If it's actually come from life, then the accommodation becomes much more difficult. And I think there is a kind of there is a sort of fear of contagion. I mean, the police talk about this. You know, they call it the policeman's disease, where officers who've worked in vice and had to deal with child pornography and rape and, you know, mutilation, sadism, all of that stuff. There is a real fear of just that the exposure to this stuff starts to affect the grammar of your imagination, and I think that is a legitimate cause of anxiety.
That's right, and I think just before we open the discussion to our audience as well, Alan, in your book in particular, we really get into the minds of our police officers. There's a whole range of them, and there's men and women and all sorts of backgrounds. You seem to have a focus on understanding police officers. What do you think happens to someone who's exposed to these levels of cruelty and violence over an extended period of time?
Well, I'm no expert on that. I'll just kind of make this stuff up.
Well, you make it convincing. We believe that this is how we would respond to
I think I was trying to draw upon what I would be thinking if I did that job and having to deal with that stuff day in, day out, and how I would try and make sense of it myself and try and stay sane. Because in my day job as a documentary maker, I was spending some time with police doing a reality TV show and running around them at 2 o'clock in the morning and getting involved in all sorts of really mundane, stupid, but often horribly violent stuff, and you think, who needs this crap in your life? So they're dealing with that all the time, but then in the midst of that, we also came across somebody who murdered his family, and it was a real sharp act of evil against all of the stupidity that they're dealing with every day, and having to try and make sense of going from one thing one day to that thing the next, and still hanging in there. And maybe those are the things that actually keep them in the job, because you could probably walk away from the dickheads any old time, but to try and put somebody away who you know needs to be out of circulation, maybe that's what keeps you in the job, but trying to make some kind of sense of what you're doing.
I know in terms of the police that I work with, and also, you know, I keep mentioning Paul Brittain, but I think he was a very influential man in the books I write. But he worked on over 100 murder investigations, and he also, you know, as I said, he deals with the criminally insane and whatever, and he has to delve into their deepest fantasies and secure units and decide if these people can ever be rehabilitated, if they can ever be released. And he likened it to, it wasn't a case of bringing his work home with him. He said you leave a little bit of your humanity behind at every crime scene, and every time you hear some twisted fantasy, and eventually there's nothing left to give. You simply, you know, and he's a very sad individual at times. You know, he just felt he's a man who just sort of gets home from work and just wants to sit in a chair and just try to think nice thoughts.
Thank you. I would love to, my mind is just racing. There are so many more questions that I would love to ask you, but let's open this discussion to our audience as well. We have a roving microphone. We'll start with a question here, please. Please wait until you have the microphone.
I was listening to a discussion earlier today that ended up involving some talk about events in Nazi Germany and death camps, etc. And the suggestion was that ascribing humanity to or allowing empathy or sympathy for people that do monstrous things is treading on really dangerous ground. Do you think that's the case? Do you think that's the case, if so, on an individual level or on a societal level? And if not...
Is this a question to all of our panellists?
Anyone who'd care to step in?
Oh no, I think it's exactly, we've said that, there are reasons, whether you disagree with them, and it doesn't excuse any of the actions, but there are, and it's not just, there will always be self-justification. People will try to justify their actions. They will try to say they're just following orders, There will always be, and the things that are most remarkable really is not to focus on the people that commit those, who follow orders and commit those offences, the people that stand up and say, no, I'm not going to. And what it is for them, the courage, and that's the flip side of someone that sort of is responsible for something terrible, is that someone does something so outrageously brave and open-hearted and good, But no, there's always, I think you've always got to accept, unless you accept the premise that someone is simply born into this world bad, then you have to accept that circumstances will always play a part in outcomes like that.
And also I think that, the issue is you've got to look at it historically and think about the way in which descriptions of behaviours have changed. And that's a product of the ongoing human attempt to understand what's going on. Understanding what's going on is not the same as endorsing it, and it doesn't preclude locking people up when they need locking up. But, if it wasn't for the spirit of trying to expand consciousness to understand everything that's going on around us, specifically in the human realm, we'd still be burning women at the stake because we thought they were witches. We'd still be describing motor neuron disease as some form of demonic possession. So you have to look at the way that the descriptive language has changed and ask yourself whether that's made things better or worse. So I think it is an obligation collectively to make that part of what we do. And if you're an artist, I think it's an obligation individually too.
And ultimately, I need to draw on this a bit further. Ultimately, do we draw lines, though? And socially, we do. We have laws, and that's where we draw the lines between what is and what isn't.
Yeah, there remains, no matter how subtle your understanding, there remains the practical question of how do you keep the rest of the population safe, and that is a completely legitimate and necessary question that has to be addressed, which is why we've got, to better and worse degrees, various systems of incarceration.
Absolutely, and it's why we have a system where, which allows us to, unless you're in America where they just have blanket sentencing, that some, a woman that suffered 20 years of absolute abuse, who finally, snaps and kills her husband, it's not just a case of saying it's murder, it's murder, it's murder, she gets life, we have a system which will hopefully judge her fairly.
Now, I saw plenty more hands up, but I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. Could you please join me in thanking Glen Duncan, Alan Carter and Michael Robotham?